Welcome back again. In this lesson, I will show you two different ways of running a search within a table view. In the first method, I will show you how to filter the content of a table view so it shows only those that you're interested in. And the other method, I will show you how to add a search display result controller that shows you a table view on top of any view that shows you the results that you're asking for. So kind of a full-on lesson, and let's get started. I'm going to go to Xcode. I'm going to start a new application. I'm going to call it Search in Table View. And in here, once I have everything, I'm going to head into my storyboard. And this time, I'm not going to use a table view controller. I'm actually going to use a table view. So I'm going to go in here and say I have a table view, which is this guy. I'm going to place it here. Not like that, like this. Then I'm going to go ahead and add a table view cell, which I need for my table view. Right when I'm here, I'm going to go ahead for my cell and say its style is basic and its identifier is cell ID. I will also add a new search bar. So a search bar I'm going to add in here. And I could actually select both the search bar and the table view, go down in here and say add missing constraints. This doesn't, to my opinion, add the best set of constraints, but for my purpose, it actually does the work. The next thing I'm going to do in my storyboard is setting the table view delegate and data source to be on my view controller. So I'm going to hold control, drag over here, say data source, do the same thing with delegate. So now both of them are set. And finally, I'm going to go to my assistant window, get myself some better, space in here, and say this is actually my search bar. It is of the type UI search bar, connect. And of course, this one is my table view. So my table view. All right, so far we haven't done anything that is new. But now let's go ahead into our view controller. And I'm going to assume that my table view shows me the names of some cities. And every time that I search in my search bar, it filters them based on what I'm asking for it. So I'm going to go in here and say, let cities array be, and this time I'm going to have to add a few more cities. So I'm going to say New York, maybe Tokyo, maybe Toronto, and Vancouver, and say Los Angeles, if that's how you spell it, I hope. Chicago, Rio, and Taipei. All right, so I have some cities in here in my cities array. And then what I'm going to have to do is I'm going to have to add the two protocols in here. So I'm going to say I need a UI table view data source, and I need a UI table view delegate. And if you remember, there are two methods that we must conform to them. I'm going to add both of those methods. One of them is called number of rows in sections. And the other one is going to be cell for row at index path. So these are the same things that we have been doing over and over and over in this section. The number of rows is going to be cities array dot count. I have to, of course, return that. And then for my cell, I'm going to say let cell to be table view dot dequeue reusing cell ID. Let me get myself a little space in here, and then go ahead and say cell dot text label dot text becomes cities array object at index path dot row, and return that cell. So by now we should have a table view that shows us these objects, and it's telling me, are you sure this thing exists? I know it is there, so let's force unwrap it, and we don't need to have that optional there anymore. Let me run the application just to get some confidence that we are in the right track. By now we should be able to see everything that we have done before, except that this time we have a little more objects in our table view. And if it all works, we should see all of these. Now the next goal is tapping in here, typing something in the search, and we want these guys to filter based on the search criteria. So let's go ahead in here. So for doing the search, I'm going to assume that we have another array that is the array of the filtered content, and we show that in our table view. So essentially, I'm going to go in here and say, once we have the cities array, I'm also going to go ahead and have variable, let's call it filtered array, which is going to be a string array and is currently empty. So we have the filtered array and we have to use it instead of the cities array. So I'm going to say every time the table view is going to show its numbers, make it based on the filtered array. And every time that you want to show a cell, make it based on the filtered array. But I'm also going to go ahead into my view did load and say right at the very beginning, filtered array is the same as the cities array. So at the beginning where there is no search happening, just duplicate everything in the cities array, place it in the filtered array. So if we run the application again, we should see exactly the same thing as before. We have the array being populated from the cities array, and that is being used to show us the items in our table view. Now that we have that, we could actually go ahead and run the search in here. To do that, I'm going to go ahead and say, in my view did load, I'm going to say my search bar dot delegate, which is of the type UI search bar delegate, becomes self. Since I'm doing that, I have to conform to that protocol. So UI search bar delegate. Now that I have the delegate, I could actually use one of its methods that is very similar to the text field text changed. And that is, let me put it at the very bottom, that's going to become text did change. So it is search bar, UI search bar text did change. Each time that the text value and the search bar actually changes, we want to filter our array based on the criteria that recently has been added there. So in text did change, the first thing I want to do is I want to say filtered array becomes a new copy of the cities array. I want to start from a fresh copy. Then I'm going to go ahead and say, as the text changes, if the text value is not empty, because it's possible that when the text changes, you're pressing the backspace and you're deleting everything. So we want to make sure that we are not at an empty mode. So I'm going to say if search bar dot text is empty, if that is not the case, then let's go ahead and filter our array. So I'm going to say if that wasn't the case, and we have to make sure that this is a non-optional value, so I could essentially allow it to autocomplete. So it's going to make that the entire thing, the search bar exists, the text exists, and it is not empty. So it's a forced unwrapped one. So in that, I'm going to say if that was the case, if there is some text visible in our search bar text, then here's what you want to do. You want to say filtered array becomes cities array dot filter. And now we have to filter it using a certain closure. And the closure I want to use is this. I want to say there is something called entry of the type a string. And here is how I want to return it, because it has to return a Boolean value. So in case this filtering is correct for this particular entry, it gets added to the filtered array. What is the condition for that? I'm going to say the condition for that is this: return entry dot contains, if it does contain the value from search bar dot text. So for instance, if your entry value is this one, New York, and here you have a value that you have entered such as N, letter N, if that N exists, it contains within entry, that returns as true. And since it returns true through the filter, it gets added to the filtered array. Otherwise, it doesn't. Once that entire process is done, I'm going to go ahead and say self.myTableView.reload data, because now we have a new filtered array. Let's go ahead and run this application now. So now we have our table view and we have our search bar, and if I type N, it actually filters it based on those. If I type T, makes it based on those guys. Now I want to show you another thing that we could do in here. If I type, for instance, N, I get the right thing. But if I type, for instance, E, it doesn't show me the right thing, even though I have characters in here that they have lowercase e. And anytime that you're running a search, it's actually better if you eliminate the capitalization, So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and say entry dot lowercase if that contains whatever we have in the text dot lowercase. And that's because the lowercase version of letters might be identical to each other. For instance, all of these letters, E or E, are exactly the same, or I or I. But if we were comparing them against each other, they would be different. But if we compare them lowercase, they both become E, and the other ones, they become I, and so on and so forth. So let me rerun the application, and now we should be able to type any combination of capital or lowercase letters, and we should still be able to filter them. So in here, I'm going to say New York, perfect, as well as a capital E, which still gets me all the results that they do have an E within them. And that's pretty much it, doing a search within a table view, and that's going to get us there. Now, this was doing a search within a table view that we already have in our storyboard. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to make a new application where we don't actually have a table view, but we have a list of items, and we want to be able to filter through those items and represent them in a table view. So in this second iteration, we don't actually have a table view in our application. What we have is perhaps a map or just a view controller that has some items, but we know that our user has access to a set of different items. And what we want to be able to do is we want to be able to search for items based on a string of text, and within those, the ones that they match our criteria, we want to see them in a table view. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and start a new application. I'm going to call this application Search Controller App, simply because in this application we'll benefit from something that's called a search controller. So what's happening in here is this. I have a view controller in my storyboard that could have essentially anything in it. The one thing that I really need to have is a search bar in it. And I'm not going to make the search bar of it in the storyboard. I'm rather going to make it programmatically, but I need to assign a container view for it. So I'm going to go in here and say I need a UI view, and this UI view, I'm going to place it somewhere up here. You can obviously set all the constraints and whatnot, but for me, that's all I want to do. I want to place it in here and say it has a light gray background. This is where my search bar is going to be. And I'm going to head back to my assistant window. In here, I'm going to make an outlet for this guy. Say this is search bar container view. So that's all I want to do in my storyboard, assuming that you will have other things in your storyboard. Most likely you will have a map or anything of the sort that can have so many different items that you can search within them. So I'm going to now head back to my view controller, and in here I'm going to go ahead and say, let me get better formatting first. And the first thing I want to do is this. I want to say I have a variable, and I'm going to call it search controller, which is of the type UI search controller. Now, a search controller is essentially a type of outlet that has a search bar as well as a results view controller. So it shows you some results after it does the search. And since I want to see the results in a table view controller, I need another outlet which is of the type table view controller. To do that, I'm actually going to go ahead and make a new file. I'm going to say Command N. I'm going to say this is of the type UI table view controller. I'm going to call it results table view controller. Now, this is a table view controller that doesn't have a storyboard outlet associated with it. We will initialize this programmatically, but we still need to do everything that we usually do for a table view. So to do that, I'm going to go ahead and say, here I have something called variable, and let's call it results array, which is in this case for what I'm doing is of the type string and is empty right at the very beginning. So there's nothing in it at the very, very beginning. The number of sections I'm actually going to remove. For the number of the rows, I'm going to say it is actually results array dot count. And then the only other method I necessarily must have is the cell for row. So I'm going to say that one. Let me get rid of everything else. For that one, I'm going to say I have a cell. That cell is using cell ID. And then I'm going to say cell.textLabel.text becomes results array index path.row. Now you might be wondering, where is the cell ID coming from? Because we don't have anything for the results table view controller in our storyboard. And that's a very valid question. We have to essentially register a cell to be used for this table view controller. And to do that, I'm going to go ahead and say, I first need to make myself a table view cell. So I'm going to start a new file, Command N, go to a view user interface type. And this one I'm going to essentially call it result cell. And as you can imagine, in here, I don't need a view. What I do need is a UI table view cell, essentially. So I need one of these guys. And this is the cell I want to use for every result that I find. The cell that I have, I'm going to call it to be cell ID for its identifier. And I'm going to go ahead and say its type is essentially basic type. That's all I have to do in terms of the most basic stuff you need to do to have a new cell. Now, the next thing and a more important thing is you have to go to your results table view controller. In your view did load, you have to register it. You essentially have to say this table view will use this kind of cell. And we do it like this. I'm going to say let nib to be UI nib, and then of the type nib name is going to be this name result cell, and we don't have a bundle for it. So we got the nib, we got access to this file, and then I'm going to go ahead and say self.tableview.register, and in the register I'm going to say register this guy, this nib, for identifier cell ID. So what this means is that I have a result cell outlet that I want to register as one of the prototype cells for my table view. So it would be very similar to you dragging a new table view cell to your table view controller, and each time you do it, you add a new ID for it, and it essentially becomes one of the prototype cells that you have access to. And now, since it is registered at view did load, we have access to it, and we can obviously use it in here. So by now we have a table view that has a results array, has the right cell, and if we can call it somewhere, it can show us the results that we want. But now we have to essentially use this results table view controller. To do that, I'm going to go to my view controller, and I'm going to initialize my results controller of the type results table view controller. So I have a new variable of that type. I'm then going to head into my view did load. The first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to say my results controller becomes a results table view controller, and that gets allocated and initialized. Then I'm going to go ahead and say this guy, my search controller, becomes a UI search controller, and one of the initializations is initialize with a certain view controller. So I'm going to say my search controller will use my result controller, which is a table view controller, as its results controller. So once it loads, it's going to show me the results in here, in this kind of view controller. You could theoretically use any kind of view controller in there, but most often what I have seen is people use a table view controller because you kind of want to be able to see the results basically by cells or by rows. You could use a collection view controller as well. That is something that we will study in this section, but most likely you want to use a table view controller in here. So once I have that, the next thing I have to do is this. I have to say my search bar container view, where I will see the search, will have a subview, and that subview is the search controller dot search bar. So I want to add the search bar from my search controller to be within my search container view. If you don't recall, search container view was this little UI view that I made in here, so I can embed my search bar within here. The next thing I'm going to do, I'm going to say, let's set the delegates. So search controller, I'm going to say dot delegate, which is of the type UI search controller delegate becomes self. So I'm going to have to add that. So that's one. So let's go ahead in here and say UI search controller delegate. That's added. Let me reformat everything. UI search controller delegate. Let me get rid of these extra spaces. And the next thing I want to add is another delegation in here, which is the search result updater. So I'm going to say search controller dot search result updater, it wants to update it in here. So the updates have to appear from some sort of a function in here. And the moment we do that, is obviously going to tell us you need to embed UI search result updating. So I'm going to add that one. And that delegate has a required method, which is essentially the update search for results. So it says update search results for this UI search controller. And it's saying, so what do you want to happen every time that we update? I'm going to write it down first. I want to filter my items and I want to reload the table view from the results view controller. And I want to present the results view controller. So a lot of things that we have to do. The very first thing we have to do is we have to filter our items, but they don't actually have any items in here because we don't have any array of items. In a real life application, this would be something that comes to you from a network. That is something we will see in a few sections from now, or you will have some static values. So I'm actually going to go ahead and copy the values from my previous application. I'm going to say, these are my objects. So I have the same cities again. So I want to filter the same guys. Once I filter them, I want to reload the table view from the results view controller based on these filtered values. So I'm going to go ahead and say my results view controller dot array. I don't remember what I called the array, results array. That becomes the cities array, and let's filter it. The filtering is going to happen exactly like what we did last time. In the filter, I'm going to give it a string. I'm going to call it entry, which is of the type a string. And I'm going to go ahead and say return if entry dot contains. And what do I want to get from the contain? I want to get the search controller dot search bar dot text. So essentially for any item in the cities array, if they have any part of the search bar text within them, if they contain that, return that as a true value and add them to the results array of the results controller. Now, finally, I have to say, once that is done, my results controller, the table view dot reload your data. The last thing that I have mentioned is present the results view controller, but that happens automatically. The moment that the value in this array is not nil, which means the results view controller has something to show, it will automatically appear. So we don't really need to worry about that part. So I'm going to get rid of all of these comments. And now the only thing I should change in here, and that's something we saw last time, maybe I want to make it lowercase in here. And also for the text, I want to make it lowercase. So essentially, every combination of the characters would work against each other. So entry lowercase contains search bar text lowercase. Now, if we run this application, we should be able to see a search bar in our container view. And if we search in it, a new table view should appear. So I'm going to go in here and say n, and it presents the ones that they have an n within them. NI, nothing, NE, only one of them, so on and so forth. And if we don't have any of them, we obviously don't see anything about the table view, simply because this view wasn't a table view. If I go back in here to my storyboard, I could actually show you that here, the background in here, it could be essentially anything. You could have maybe a text view, a large text view that is in here. And I'm actually going to set the constraints for it. So vertical spacing, leading, trailing, and the bottom spacing. And what I could do is I could make its background color different. So this is a view controller that is doing, its own thing. Maybe you have some information on it. Maybe you have a map on it or any other kind of object. But then you also have a set of items that you want to be able to filter through them. So I could go in here and say new. And then if I get New York, maybe you want to do something that when I tap on that, that one essentially appears in here, or anything of the sorts that you can simply imagine to do. So that was a quick introduction of how to use search within a table view, or how to use search using a search controller, which allows for both the search and a results view controller to be presented. Let's keep it up to here, and I'm going to move on to our next lesson.